Get 5 coffins ready.
Hey, what's up everybody, Shinmilk here, and today we're going to be talking about the 5 classes in SMITE. So the classes are Mages, Hunters, Assassins, Guardians, and Warriors. Now, look, they may have classes on them, but there are subclasses as well. That's too much to get into for this video, so if you guys want to see a video about that, or about the roles that these classes take, just let me know, but it's definitely worth a separate video entirely to talk about them. And we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of each class to find out which class is best for you generally. And we'll go in order of how many characters are in each class, so we'll start with Mages. So the main thing about Mages is that they tend to have a lot of range, which is really good for new players. They can be really intimidating to just walk up to people and try and do damage, or blink in front of people if you even know what blink is at this point. And of course, they also do a lot of damage, so basically the most damage in the game possible, at least in a confined amount of time. And as well, they have some pretty good CC as well. Not close to like Warriors or Guardians or anything like that, not like a tank would have, but their CC does tend to be really good enough for self-setup at least. So good range, good damage, and you can set up for yourself. But the cons come in with cooldowns. So you have these long-range, heavy-handing abilities, but if you miss them, they're now on cooldown, and you are kind of useless. Generally in SMITE, most of the abilities are actually pretty easy to hit, so it's not that big of a deal, but if you miss an ability or you use it too late, as in enemies are already in your face as you're about to use the ability, so you're going to get punished anyways, yeah, it can feel a little rough. And speaking of being killed, you are very easy to kill. Mages are the squishiest characters in the game, and even when you're ahead, an assassin can still just bop you and kill you. They're also quite reliant on items. Of course, you want some cooldown reduction to get those cooldowns down, so that if you do miss abilities, you can use them again sooner. Or just in general, the idea of doing more damage over the course of a fight because you have lower cooldowns. And of course, they have very high power scaling. So we're going to explain this real quick. There's scaling, that is, your ability's base damage scales up, and then there's also power scaling. And the power scaling is why mage abilities do so much damage. You'll notice the base damage is pretty similar across the game, but then the scaling on tanks is very low, hunters medium, and then mages very, very high. And they use magical power as well, which you can just get more of in SMITE than you can physical power. So a higher percentage with the higher literal power number means you do a lot more damage. But that does mean you're more reliant on items. You gotta get a lot of items, a lot of expensive, high power items, as well as your penetration and cooldown reduction, also that you're a hard-hitting, consistently hard-hitting, burst damage dealer. And another thorn in the side is that they tend not to be very mobile. Not to say mages don't have dashes or leaps, but they tend to be not very strong dashes or leaps, and a lot of mages actually don't have any dashes or leaps at all, and instead just increase their movement speed, little things like that. So if you're, for instance, against a fed member of our next class, you're going to be in a lot of trouble as a mage. When it comes to assassins, they prioritize high burst damage. I mean, it's the highest burst damage in the game other than those very late game mages once they have all those items I talked about. And of course, their main target, them being the sort of physical counterparts to mages even though they're melee, is those mages. And so the squishiest characters in the game getting jumped on by melee, second highest damage in the game characters. And a very important thing about assassins is once they get ahead, i.e. like killing a mage early on in the game to start getting fed, it's really, really hard to stop most of them. Some of them you can kind of wait out their damage, like I said earlier. Their damage just start to fall off, but most of them can still just one-shot any mage in the game if they're ahead. And generally speaking, they have pretty strong CC to help themselves or the team. Now, not every single time, but oftentimes they'll have a piece of hard CC like a stun or a root to set up for themselves, unlike mages who may have sort of meh CC. This is really hard CC, but that you can typically only hit on one person, but there are certain cases like, for instance, Thor Wall or Susanoo Ultimate, where you can actually just peel your team like you're a tank. And or set up for yourself as if the tank's set up for you. And of course, they also get around the map faster than other classes. Generally speaking, most assassins have a dash or a leap, or at the very least increase their movement speed greatly just by using their abilities. So running around the jungle as a mage is going to be nowhere near as fast as with an assassin, so that ties back to them being very hard to stop once they get going. Since if there's a fight, they're going to be there quicker than anyone else on the team. But here comes the cons. They are still very squishy, not as squishy as mages, but still, they kind of need that since, of course, again, they're melee characters, meaning they gotta be right up to the enemy in order to hit them. And there's very few assassin abilities that are actually long range. And if they are long range, like for instance a Thor Hammer or a Humbat's 3, it's hard to hit, generally speaking. And again, it's not like those abilities are alone are enough to kill somebody. You still need to be in someone's face in order to kill them, which can be hard considering you don't actually have that much health compared to a mage, for instance. And on that point, even though their damage tends to be pretty good until the very late game, they're almost always useless when they get behind. Because again, they're squishy, they need to be diving the enemy team to do damage. So now you have someone who's under-leveled, was already squishy to begin with, trying to dive the enemy backline. Yeah, typically it's hard to pull off without dying. And that ties into them requiring really good judgment to just not die or get peeled off targets by the enemy team. So they require the most Smite know-how to pull off, even if they are mechanically pretty easy. And of course, who would be peeling them off other than our next class, Guardians? Now, Guardians are very tanky. They're the tankiest class in the game. I mean, they're called Guardians, so you could guess that. But they also have a lot of CC, a lot. Smite characters all have 4 abilities, other than stance switchers, but they all have 4 abilities, and typically 3 of the 4 abilities on Guardians contain some sort of CC. Whether it's a slow, a stun, a knock-up, and so on, and it's almost always AoE as well. So that means not only is it easy to hit, but you can affect multiple people at a time with that hard CC. And thanks to that, they tend to actually still be useful from behind. Yes, a Guardian who's behind, they're very easy to kill. They're slow, they're big, so they're easy to hit. So if they're behind, yeah, you can kind of not feel tanky, but that hard CC that Guardians have is always going to be there. Whether you're ahead or whether you're behind, a 2-second stun is still a 2-second stun. You can't take that away from them. And as such, they're generally pretty easy to play. Again, lots of AoE, room for forgiveness with that tankiness, and so on. And also, you can be versatile with your builds too. Of course, there's standard support builds where you just go, this tanky item that gives you cooldown reduction, this tanky item that gives your teammates protections, little things like that, but you can even splash some damage on them using those mage items we talked about earlier. Typically only one of those items, but still. It gives them this versatility of actually dealing decent damage and having all this crazy hard CC too. But the cons, as I mentioned, they're slow and big, and you need to be in the front. You need to not be scared as Guardians, which is hard to do if you're a new player. It also requires you to have good game sense, that is, knowing what your teammates are doing at all times to both enable them and protect them. Because of course, say you hit a stun on somebody. Well, that's great, but you didn't realize that your teammate started walking away, so that stun was pointless, and now you're alone, and now you're dead. And also, sometimes it requires you to compromise your builds in order to get counter items. Something like a Spectral, which counters crit, something like a Mid-Guardian, which counters attack speed, something like Pestilence, which counters healing, and so on. So you don't always build what you want to build, because you just have to go these counter items, and Guardians are the best ones to buy them, so you're stuck with that. And if you don't buy them, your teammates will yell at you, but the actual worst part of it is, it does genuinely impact the game massively. And speaking of crit and attack speed, let's talk about Hunters. So Hunters have consistent ranged damage, obviously, because they focus on using ranged basic attacks. That's their main source of damage. So you don't have cooldowns like with Mages. I mean, you have an attack speed, right? So technically there's a cooldown in between your basic attacks, but you know what I mean. And they're also very necessary to have due to structure and objective damage. That means things like towers, Fire Giant, Gold Fury. You really can't take down structures easily without a Hunter. And of course this is the role that can deal with tanks better than other classes can. Now, some mages can do decent tank damage, but assassins are really bad at tank damage, and obviously other tanks can't really deal with tanks. So these ranged, constant DPS characters who can build tons of penetration and keep themselves at a distance while they shred the tanks makes them absolutely perfect for dealing with lots of tanks. Obviously, there's been some balance issues in the past with Smite in this regard, but still, it's a big bonus, especially if the team has something like triple tank. Then you just go and pick 2 Hunters. Now you can deal with the tanks better. And also, generally speaking, they have decent CC. Again, like with Mages and Assassins, it's mostly for self setup, but it can also be for peel as well. And they also tend to be a lot more mobile than Mages. Now, the obvious downside here, for one, you need to be good at hitting your basic attacks, and you need to hit them at max range. So that's for 2 reasons. Obviously, more range means more safe, but you have to also keep in mind the basic attack movement speed penalty. This is something huge that I see so many players just not acknowledge. When you're basic attacking in Smite, you're slowed down, especially if you're not walking forward. When you're walking backwards, there's a backpedal penalty, so you're moving slower, and then you're slowed down further with basic attacking. So if you're just moving backwards while holding down the basic attack button, it's over. You're moving way too slow. You're going to get jumped on. This is why you see a lot of Hunters kite. Basically what that is you hold down the basic attack button, hit a basic attack, and then stop holding down the basic attack button so that you can move yourself. It's a pain in the butt, so you don't really need to practice that when you're first starting out, but just make sure you're keeping yourself at maximum range. And this is also because, of course, they're nearly as squishy as Mages. Not quite as squishy as Mages, they're a little bit beefier because, again, they need to stand there basic attacking and slowing themselves down, so they put themselves at a bigger risk than Mages who can just throw out an ability and walk away. But again, like mages, they're really item reliant, probably the most item reliant class in the game. They need attack speed, penetration, and lifesteal, and depending if crit is good or not, they need critical strike chance as well. You 100% need all of these things in your build. And so depending on what's happening in the match, you might not have the item you need to be relevant. Like say a tank gets fed, you need your penetration item, but you already started a crit item. So now your crits are going to be hitting for nothing, but you gotta finish that item before you get your penetration. So getting behind can be a huge pain, especially in certain matchups. Hunters, I would say, are among the most matchup dependent class in the game. Sometimes you're just against another hunter who has a better early game, they get ahead, they get their items, and you don't, you feel bad. But of course it all comes around. Once you get your items, you're still a hunter. Once you get at about 5 items, you have your attack speed, penetration, lifesteal, and or critical strike chance. You'll have all those things decked out, so all you need to do is just wait it out, even in a bad matchup. But speaking of matchups, I think warriors take the cake of being the most matchup dependent class in the game. Now warriors are nice and tanky, not as tanky as guardians generally speaking, but they are very tanky, so again, good for new players. They do medium damage, but with very flexible builds. They can build assassin style items, pure tank style items, and sort of like in-betweener items that have a decent amount of health and a decent amount of power. And on that, there's very clear points of strength in each and every character. Some have lots of CC, some are very good at chasing people down, or have literal direct counters like Odin Cage, which is an ability that creates an area where no healing can be done. And of course, you can't get out, so if you're against a character who doesn't have a leap, yeah, they're screwed. And with all this versatility, if you build right, you will be completely impossible to stop when you're ahead. You're tanky, you deal almost as much damage as an assassin, and they tend to actually be pretty mobile as well. Not as mobile as an assassin, but most characters definitely have good movement. So some of the cons, they do actually have even less range than guardians in most circumstances. Typically you need to use that blink relic I mentioned earlier a lot on warriors because they're just stubby. And so that issue of being useless from behind also comes back up. But unlike assassins, you don't have insane amounts of base damage to work off of. It's just moderate damage, which works when you're ahead, but when you're behind, you're just dealing no damage, you're not as tanky as a guardian, and you don't do as much damage as an assassin, so they're really in a rough spot if you get behind. Which is a problem because they're definitely the most matchup dependent class, as I've mentioned. It is so easy just to get into a counter matchup and just have no way of doing anything. Now, if you are in a counter matchup, luckily in SMITE, at least right now, you can generally just sit under your tower, get your first or second item, and then you're fine. You probably only lost 1 or 2 levels, but still, if you start getting camped and invaded by the enemy jungler, which happens a lot to me, yeah, it can be really bad. But again, they're a super versatile class. I would say just as versatile as the mage class. So, speaking of which, let me know if you'd like to hear about those subclasses I mentioned earlier. I'd be more than happy to make a subclass video for every single class in this game. It's not really something that's actively recognized by SMITE, so if you look up subclasses for SMITE, it's going to be a lot of anecdotal stuff. And obviously there's no subclass button in SMITE to filter them out, so I hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know. If you're a new player, did this help you iron out which class you should be looking at for a new character? Or if you're an existing player, how well do you think I explained things, and what's your favorite class? Thank you for watching.